Terry?
Well, thanks, Dennis. And Pat, it's really appreciate you doing this. Just for everybody to know that Pat is Professor Emeritus at School of Medicine and Public Health, and he practiced for 15 years at CDC and Wisconsin Division of Public Health. He joined UW, where he directed the Population Health Institute, the Master of Public Health program, and the Preventive Medicine Residency program, as well as being Associate Dean for Public Health. His research focuses on developing methods to measure the health of communities and use that to move action toward community health and equity. He has his MD from UW, internal medicine internship at Virginia Mason in Seattle. And I'd never heard of that one, Pat, sorry. Mm-hmm. The Epidemic Intelligence Service and Preventive Medicine Residency at the CDC. Also has an MPH from University of Minnesota, and has worked with just scores and scores of folks from the La Follette School and the public health major that we joined, got together joint with that, and has been a good friend and someone I admire in terms of his athleticism on biking and skiing. So Pat, thanks for taking time to tell us what the heck's going on with COVID now that you finally had it.
Yes, I was, for those of you who just joined, I was telling Terry that, as a public health doctor and a spokesperson in the state on best practices, I stayed COVID-free. I was one of those, I think, lucky, really. It is a bit of luck. When people ask me if I'd had COVID, I would say not yet. And it did catch up to me most likely on a return flight from Atlanta, ironically, to go to CDC to a editorial board meeting there. So, but I had a very mild case, and we can talk about that in this conversation. Excuse me, and I have just a slight lingering cough. So that's I'm now about 3 weeks out. But I'm happy to. I don't know if there's a chat function here. I can open up the chat window. It looks like it's a possibility. So
yes,
please feel free if you have any questions. That's probably the way to do it. You could raise your hand, I think, and be recognized. But I think it's much better when you're talking with folks to really have the ability to ask questions and interrupt. So as much as this can be a conversation on Zoom, the better. I did put together some slides to sort of structure my conversation. And what I thought I'd do is talk about these, begin at the end, which is what do we do with what can we do to prevent respiratory illness? And COVID is, an incredibly important respiratory illness, but it's not the only one. We've heard now about RSV and obviously flu. So I will sort of talk about those 3 respiratory viruses, and then and I'll do that sharing my slides. So let's see if I can share my desktop and then go to PowerPoint and go to presentation mode. Let's see if I'm down in my basement. This is a little. Now, what do you see? You probably see my notes, right? You see everything.
Yes.
Let's see if I can change that. Let's see. Swap displays. Is that then
perfect?
Okay. So I thought I'd talk about COVID-19 and flu and RSV. Oh my, what have we gotten ourselves into? So I thought I'd begin by giving an overview of respiratory viruses, a little bit of biology, and then talk about vaccines, and then what the current recommendations are, sort of what my recommendations are, and then leave plenty of time for discussion. Now, this goes till what, some 10 minutes before 11? Is that how do you, what's the timing?
You can go to 11.
11 o'clock. Okay, perfect. So the flu stands for influenza, not to be confused with gastrointestinal illnesses. And in general, you know that flu causes mild cold symptoms in most people, but can lead to hospitalization, even death for older people and for babies. And fortunately, the vaccine was developed many years ago, interestingly using fertilized chicken eggs, which is still a method used to produce most flu vaccines today. And it continues to be one of the 10 leading causes of death worldwide. Now, I think in the US, it's about 9th overall. So influenza is a really important virus, and it circulates globally and continues to affect our health. Now, the interesting thing about the virus and just viruses in general is how they're structured. And I found this graphic, it's really great to think about how these viruses have evolved. They have DNA, or really the material that they use to reproduce and replicate. And then they're surrounded by a capsule with many proteins that stick out. And it so happens that the influenza virus has two really important proteins, one called hemagglutinins, and you can see that in the blue, and then the neuraminidase proteins shown in red, and then all sorts of other things like an ion channel, and then the RNA, or the DNA information, really the coding and how these viruses replicate. And it turns out that this hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, these H and N proteins, are really important. And we see two types of flu, what's called influenza A and B. A causes pandemics, B very rarely does. And then you begin to subtype the viruses, the influenza A virus, by those proteins. So you'll hear, even this year, you're hearing about what viruses are circulating, which predominant type, H1N1 shown here, H3N2. And the reason that's important is the way we fight viruses is we recognize those proteins on the outside, those H and N proteins, and our antibodies stick to them and attack them and hopefully neutralize them. Now you can see that there's clades and subclades and subvariants, and this has relatively little to do with our immunity because we generally attack the large proteins, but it can affect the efficacy of our immune response. But for flu, really, we don't talk about those subtypes, those groups and subtypes. We really talk about the predominant mix. And here's a chart showing what predominated in the US, basically worldwide, by year. And how this happens, it's pretty random. These viruses mutate, and then one becomes more efficient in the population. The virus itself, H1N1, for example, might circulate in the 1950s. It achieves immunity either, back in the 50s, it'd be through illness, not vaccine. And then it goes away. It doesn't come back because a lot of people have immunity. But you can see here the predominant viruses, and then how severe that season was from H3N2 back in 2014, and then we had H3N2 come back in 2017. And you can see then the incidence, the number of people per 100% who are infected. And what you see here, kind of move this little there. You can see here is that the percentages tend to be high in infants, and then sometimes higher in people over age 65. And for example, in 2018, about 10% of those over 65 were infected, almost 1 in 5 young kids. Notice what happened in 2021. Everybody went inside. We all self-quarantined, and flu did not circulate, nor did respiratory syncytial virus, which I'll talk about. So we basically had a year off. That was phenomenal. I mean, what a natural experiment to basically have people stop seeing each other, stay at home, don't shake hands, wear masks, and we made flu go away. So lesson to be learned is flu can be controlled without vaccines and simply by changing our behaviors. Now, that's a pretty strict way to make flu go away, to isolate and stay at home. But it was fascinating when we did not have flu in that year, that first year of COVID. Oops. And this is kind of a hard number to come up with. These are the number of people who die from influenza each year, mostly older people because of the higher what's called case fatality rate. The more serious illness happens in older people with compromised immune systems. And the number is somewhere in the range of 30 to 50,000 people. Again, you can see 2017, 2018, the highest in the past decade. And again, in the year early in COVID, this is actually 2019, 2020, no deaths were recorded and even fewer in that year. And so just think about 50,000 deaths a year. For Wisconsin, that'd be about 1,000 people in our state dying from influenza. And again, in Wisconsin, around 50,000 people die each year. So it's about 2% of all deaths. So with that as background, what about COVID-19? First thing you notice is these viruses tend to look alike. These are electron micrographs, or probably artist rendition of what an electron micrograph looks like. But you notice the proteins. And in fact, the reason this is called COVID, the reason these viruses are called coronaviruses, is you look at those spike proteins and it looks like the corona around the sun during an eclipse. And so that's how this virus was named. And it turns out these proteins are the keys that unlock the entry point to a cell. So this virus gets into your respiratory mucosa, gets into your, then comes into a cell, and that spike protein fits the lock, and it opens the ion channel and allows this virus to amazingly open up and inject its DNA, its replicating code, and then that DNA goes in and replicates the virus. It overwhelms the cell, and then the cell usually dies, and now the virus is spreading. Obviously, beginning an immune response, both when that virus enters the bloodstream, then when it enters the cell, enters the lymph system, and that's when we begin fighting it. And we fight it, again, based on those red spike proteins. And this was a novel coronavirus when in 2019, that's why it's called the novel coronavirus. There are 7 known coronaviruses, now 7 to cause human disease. Common colds are 4 of them, and then SARS and MERS. And those were serious coronaviral diseases, but interestingly, they were very people getting those diseases were very symptomatic, and we could use traditional public health tools. If somebody gets sick, you put them into you put them into isolation, you quarantine those people exposed, and we took care of those diseases because symptoms began, and then people became contagious. What we learned from the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is that it became contagious before symptoms developed. And that made the more traditional isolate and quarantine public health responses virtually impossible. I went on public radio in, I think, March, or yes, it must have been March of 2020. And I said, well, I'm not so worried because we'll just do isolation and quarantine, take care of this novel coronavirus. And we learned that was not going to be effective. And in fact, early on, the US led the world in the highest incidence rates of COVID. not sure exactly why, but it seemed to spread further faster in the US. Again, this is pre-vaccine than elsewhere in the world. And this slide shows what we see, which is sort of deaths above and below normal. So we normalize the number of deaths. That's your predicted number of deaths. And then you can see in 2017, 2018 flu season, which is the H3N2, you can see there that we were about 15% above expected deaths due to flu. And so that's, those are those 50,000 deaths. But look what happens in 2020. We go 40% above in the early weeks. And so the COVID pandemic in that first year was truly dramatic. And again, people who sort of dismiss COVID as not a real thing can't be looking at the numbers, because these were obviously real numbers and an amazing, unprecedented global pandemic. And why I was interested in COVID, and I think many of those on this Zoom call today, is that it was particularly serious in older people. So this is what we call case fatality rates on the left, so that for young people, for every 100 infected, maybe 0.2 or maybe 1 out of 500 kids would die from COVID. This was early in the pandemic, pre-vaccine again. Let me emphasize this. This is in a population without any immunity. But look at the numbers. I'm in my 60s, so 4% case fatality rate. I don't want to get any infection that causes 1 death in 25 people. And look, 80 and older, 15%. So 1 out of 7 people infected with SARS-CoV-2 would die. And if you look on the right, those are hospitalization, ICU admissions, and then case fatality rates. If you're 85 and older, about 1/3 of people infected ended up in the hospital, and 6% admitted to the ICU, and 10% died. Incredibly serious disease. And then this shows what we were able to do, looking at death rates under 65 in dark blue and over 65 in light blue. And you can see beginning in December or early January 2021, COVID-19 vaccine became available. It's the one time, we're rarely rewarded for being older, but I remember being an older faculty member and going down to UHS and proudly standing in line with my older colleagues to get our vaccine, because we were a priority population. And I was vaccinated in those first weeks. And you can see a dramatic drop in the number of deaths. And then obviously the new variants came, but we got the booster, it dropped again, increased, and then the second booster became available. And the good news here is deaths have went up in August, but down in September. And you can see very low numbers for those under 65. And this is still a concern. COVID has not gone away. I personally know 2 people, one who just passed of COVID, about my age, a little older, and one who's in hospice and is in the process of dying from COVID. And so it is real, and it is still here.
Pat, can I interrupt for a second? One of the
please
things
do.
when I find deniers all the time about this, they'll say that, excuse me, they'll say that it was the guy had a heart attack. The guy had heart problems. He didn't die of COVID. They were just coding it that way because they could get extra money from the feds, and it wasn't COVID that killed him. It was the heart attack, that he had bad heart, or he was some other chronic thing. And so how do you count that? That doesn't count. That's how they tell me. That's how they.
Well, what I do is just tell them. So tell them it's pretty simple math. Each year we know how many people die. We have 100 years of experience to know this, to predict this. And when we do this, sometimes we see a few more people dying, a few less. There are about 1 million more people, 1 million more deaths in the last 2 or 3 years than we would have predicted happen. So those those did, there wasn't an epidemic of cancer, an epidemic of heart disease, an epidemic of, diabetes. Those diseases have been relatively stable. The epidemic, what caused the pandemic and the excess deaths was COVID. Now, it's hard to tell people what risk is. Risk is not, it's not on or off. It's not yes or no. Risk increases the chances. And so, yes, if you have a chronic breathing problem, if you're being treated for cancer, if you've just had surgery, those chronic conditions, it increases your risk. But if COVID weren't there, you would not have died. These people I know were in relatively good health. And so clearly those are COVID, what you might call an underlying cause. And yes, I think it's a good example of making a mistake in public health in that we said any COVID related. So if COVID contributed to the death, this person had cancer, they were, in hospice, they got COVID and they died within 3 days. We counted that because that was COVID contributing to that death, accelerating the process. But you're right, it's not exactly a hard science. If you parse that out, you'd say, well, COVID was a contributing factor, but there was an underlying factor that caused the chain of event that led to this death. COVID definitely contributed, but it was not the underlying factor. I just go back to the excess in deaths. By the way, I have a friend who denies this, that there is such a thing as COVID, and he claims that the correlation between this excess death, that vaccines went up during this period, and it's vaccines. These are vaccine-related deaths because they're associated. As vaccines went up, so did death. And it's like, where do you begin that conversation? I mean, I'm just at a loss to talk to somebody who believes that association is causal. So that's what I do. I just talk about, and sometimes people are convinced more by personal anecdote. And so you just talk about a friend who, was otherwise healthy, got COVID and died. So I think it's a combination of, the other thing is just talk to a doctor, talk to somebody who's been in the health system and has lived this. For someone to say that these are regular people who are at the end of their life simply having COVID tip the scale, it's not reality. But we can talk about.
Yeah, I told him that you can also, someone bleeds to death at a hospital or dies after a grizzly bear attack. I said, well, you didn't call it. They died of something at the hospital. But no, these died because the grizzly bear got them.
Yeah,
that's the reason they're having these problems. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's a good question. The underlying cause of death is that disease or injury that led to a chain of events that eventually caused this person to die. And you could argue that somebody, in the late stages of lung cancer who gets COVID, lung cancer is the underlying cause of death because that led to a series of events that eventually led to their death. But COVID contributed. And we know from comparing observed to expected death rates that there were 1 million more people who died than we would have expected had COVID not been around. That's just what I say. We're well over 1 million excess deaths now in this country alone.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at this is just from an hour ago. The good news is that those deaths, and again, look at the numbers. This is in the same range as annual influenza deaths, but these are weekly. So we're seeing as many people die a week during 2020, 2021, as you see an entire year from influenza. The good news is that this last September, since last summer, it's the lowest peak of deaths. And you see just those last 3 provisional numbers, it appears that this little bump we saw in September is going back down. The other thing is you see great regional variability. This is death rates, I think, per 100,000 per million. And this aligns closely with the uptake of vaccine and with other social distancing practices. The other thing that's amazing, when I started reading about the novel coronavirus, is I learned that it mutates about once a week. And I said, oh, that you know, that's going to be a problem.
Wow.
And so now, I mean, you just look at what's happens from, you know, this is from 2019 to 2020. So this is just what, 4 months. And look what happened. And so we've all learned a little bit about virology, talking about the Delta variant, the Omicron, and now, you know, the sub-variants. Some of these mutations are not meaningful in that they simply change the genetic code. The proteins don't change, or the proteins might change, but they have no effect. Other times the protein changes significantly, and we've built, for example, immunity or vaccine against, you know, the spike protein that looked like the Delta variant, and now you've got Omicron. And Omicron was a good example of a variant that our immune system didn't work as well against the vaccines, and so it was very much reduced vaccine efficacy. So let me end then by talking about RSV, and that in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that this respiratory syncytial virus looks a lot like the other viruses, and it causes mild symptoms in most people, but can lead to hospitalization and even death. Many people had never heard about it. My brother-in-law, my sister and brother-in-law are upstairs visiting, and they went in and somebody said, "Do you want an RSV shot?" And they said, "What's that?" And well, we can, you know, vaccinate against RSV. He said, "Well, what's RSV?" They're lawyers. And they said, "Well, you should get it." Okay, he took the shot. And then he comes to me and says,
Wow.
"Should I have done that?" And I said, "Well, not unreasonable."
Right.
And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so RSV, COVID-19, because we all went indoors and we didn't see much respiratory virus transmission, there was less transmission of this regular winter virus. And so for that 2020, 2021 winter, we saw less RSV. And then last year, hospitalization rates really went up 10 times higher than expected. And more people became infected, probably as a result of us getting back in person, maskless contact, and also less immunity from the prior year. So the best estimate is that maybe 50,000 kids and 177,000 adults are older adults are hospitalized, but as many as 300 kids and about 14,000 adults die from RSV annually. And so this is less than influenza, but it's important and it's interesting. The reason it's not been talked about is there's not a lot we can do about it. There were vaccine trials that started in the 50s, and then in the 60s, there was a major disaster in that the vaccine killed more people. 2 kids died in the trial, and so people stayed away from it. And all of a sudden, as a new protein imaging technique was developed, people were able to make the vaccine. Turns out that it does affect older people, but it really is harder on people with chronic lung disease or weakened immune systems or certain underlying conditions, especially people living in nursing homes or long-term care facilities. And so what do we recommend? Well, there are vaccines now for all 3 respiratory viruses. And you know about the flu vaccine, and it's effective. Although, let me just point out, this is percent effective in actual practice. And some years, like in 2014, they guess wrong on the H and N proteins. And so the match isn't really good, or there are other factors that make the vaccine less effective. But in general, the vaccine is 50 to 60% effective. And again, look at 2021. There was no way to tell because there was basically no flu that year. So you get a flu shot, you might get a sore arm, you might feel a few symptoms for a day or two, and you're 50 to 60% less likely to get infected with flu. Now, these numbers, an important thing is you're more protected from serious illness. So that's something important to remember, is that the vaccine can have different effectiveness depending on the outcome. Just getting flu and having symptoms is one outcome, and that's what these numbers are. But getting hospitalized and eventually dying, that's really the number we're interested in. And then second thing is, what about the COVID vaccines? This, if you heard the news yesterday, this year's Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for the developers of the COVID vaccine. Interestingly, footnote, Dr. John Wolfe in 1990 published a paper in Science, first to show proof of concept that you can put RNA into cells. Again, RNA is the mirror of DNA, and it's the way cells divide and make proteins, importantly. And so John showed that. The problem was, for 15 years, they tried to do that, but the cell would attack the RNA, and the investigators at Penn were able to find a way to reduce the immune response to the RNA, so the RNA can actually do its work, produce a protein, and then that protein would protect the cells from infection. And so these, very effective vaccines, on the order of, Pfizer was a little less effective, but you can see vaccine efficacy in the 75 to 100% range, and more so again for serious illness. But again, this efficacy wanes over time, and this is shown in weeks. And finally, I mentioned the RSV vaccine was not available until just this year. FDA approved 2 of them. And so my brother-in-law, while he was asking me, did he do the right thing, I went and revisited the CDC recommendation. It's technically not CDC, it's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, a private, unbiased, unpaid group of experts who makes recommendations, and then the CDC sort of adopts or endorses them. But it is that, and this is waffling. This is like, adults 16 and over may receive using shared clinical decision-making. And what does that mean? It means you talk to your doctor about your risk of having severe RSV, but also you take into consideration your own characteristics, values, and preferences. Are you the type of person who maybe, practices very safe infection control? You avoid people, who might be sick, you don't shake hands, etc. Or are you somebody who really wants to be super protected and willing to do everything you can? And sometimes healthcare providers have a different sort of clinical discretion. And then the characteristics of the vaccine, as it's rolling out, it'll be continued to be studied. So currently it's a single dose, but we're going to see whether revaccination is needed over time. So literally, this is something that just happened, and people like my brother-in-law are arriving at vaccine clinics to get a COVID vaccine, a booster, and get, come home with another. Get your annual flu shot. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer. You have 50%. I see my internet is unstable. So Terry, let me know if it's anything, if it's any problem hearing. Can you hear me okay? I can't
you
see.
froze up just for a minute, but you're okay.
Okay. Yep. So get your annual flu shot. Get your booster, your COVID-19, stay up to date with vaccines and boosters. And then I'd say talk to your doctor about RSV vaccine. I'm sitting on the fence for me personally. I said if I was sitting in a chair and somebody had it loaded up in the needle, I'd probably say sure. But I'm not 100% sure that I'd go and make an appointment to go get RSV because I'm otherwise in good health, don't have any chronic conditions. And I'm sort of on the fence. But if anybody has, any questions, I mean, that's something to talk to your doctor about. I want to also point out there are other things you can do besides vaccines. Just avoid being around sick people. We had a gathering of our family yesterday and heard this morning that one of the attendees at that gathering has just been diagnosed with COVID, a young person. It's like, oh my. Well, if you look, we were outside, we were socially distant, She didn't have symptoms. And I no longer shake hands. So I was, maybe within 3 feet for 30 seconds. So no meaningful exposure for me, and I think for most people. So be outside as much as you can and practice social distancing. If you do go out, if you do go into a high-risk setting, consider wearing a mask. Again, I flew on an airplane coming home from Atlanta. I wore a mask. I've got a problem with this beard because even KN95s, they don't really work. It does not keep air from coming in. So the mask probably is almost completely ineffective in protecting me. It probably protects others because my cough or whatever the droplets probably get caught as I cough or sneeze. And so it's a mask for somebody with a beard, and masks in general, I think, are better at preventing other people from getting sick. They're not so effective unless they really are well fit. And that means you don't put them around your ears, you put it on your face, you breathe in, and if it stays there, then you've got a good fit. Otherwise, it's probably going to do little, if anything. So, but it does help. If you're sick, stay home. That's the other thing. Don't forget that, viruses, anybody who gets COVID got it from somebody who made a decision maybe to go out symptomatic, and stop shaking hands. In February of 2020, I went to a Sauk County Medical Society meeting. I read about coronavirus. I said, oh my God. I mean, back then we thought maybe 10% of people my age could die. You think I'm going to shake your hand? No. So I was doing elbow bumps, and people went, oh, Dr. Remington, he's a public health guy. He's afraid of getting sick. And it was like, yes, I don't see any reason. I saw you just cough into your hand. And now you offer that as a gesture. That's done. So I now 100%, I just fist bump. It's very unlikely you're going to have a virus on the back of your hand. And should I get it on my hand, less likely. It turns out fomite transmission is not common, but if you want to transmit something, sneeze in your hand and shake somebody's hand, it's probably going to work. So that's my sort of one recommendation on ways to stay safe. So that's it. I think I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, you got a few things there for chats.
Yep.
The question I'd have is, do we take them all? So I've got the same option to get pneumonia, flu, RSV, and COVID. And I'm thinking about having them one at a time so I can see what the reaction is. Is that
Seems reasonable. So my brother-in-law got RSV and COVID in the same arm because he only wanted one sore arm. My sister got it one here and one here. She wanted to compare. Neither was sore. Actually, RSV was a little more sore because it's a little higher volume, and there's some tissue damage when you put a bolus of fluid in your arm. I don't think it's unreasonable either. I mean, I think if there were if there was any evidence on a recommended practice, then we would recommend that. We would say, don't do these together. Immunity is very specific, as you can imagine. You go outside, if there's, alternaria or, ragweed, you have very specific antigen responses. And so, yes, it's probably a little bit more of a shock on your immune system to all of a sudden say, whoa, there's RSV antigen, there's COVID antigen, and there's influenza antigen, but maybe that gears up your system. You want a good antibody response, right? You want your body to say, oh, these are bad things, make antibodies. You get a little soreness, but now you're in a better position when the virus comes. That may be the case. What would I do? I have a slight reluctance of getting like 3 shots at once. So I only got the flu shot because they didn't offer me anything else. I went to work and they gave me a flu shot. So I would say it's up to you. It's a personal preference issue.
But they also offered pneumonia shot.
Well, that's a different question. So that's a bacteria. And that's sort of a one shot. So I talked about the viruses.
Right.
Yes, and that's a bacterial pneumonia, also called old man's friend, pneumococcal pneumonia. And it's very serious. It's not very common, but we now have a vaccine. So Medicare pays for it. So Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's any evidence one way or the other. Certainly in children, we have been giving multiple vaccines in children for decades, and they do just fine. So MMRs, mumps, measles, and rubella, and those are very different viruses. And kids get MMR DPT. So it's like they do fine.
Okay. So you have some chats you might want to answer.
Oh, sure. I can look here. Yeah, watch out about Nancy, good comment. Yes, that's very interesting. Insurance companies always look at recommendations. And the may modifier also means that the insurance companies may not pay for it. I think you can get vaccines. The good thing about COVID, the downstream effects is all of a sudden there's lots of options for getting vaccines. And so I think you can find free vaccines if you look around at health departments, at, sometimes at, CVS. And so, and again, being on Medicare, I don't know about whether Medicare coverage covers RSV. So that's always a good question. It's not terribly expensive, but sometimes you get a $300 bill for a shot. So, oh no, there's no reason. So there are two reasons to get a vaccine. One is to protect yourself, and the other is to protect the herd. And if we could get 90% of people vaccinated in the entire population, then you would have herd immunity. We're not trying that with RSV. RSV is going to come through most people between young infants and elderly people with chronic conditions. Most people do just fine. It's a mild illness. There's no reason to vaccinate. So there's no reason with RSV to try and get the whole herd or 90% of the herd so that you actually stop transmission. So no, young people, I don't think they're even eligible for the vaccine. There's no recommendation for people under 60, besides infants. I don't know about spike protein. You hear so many things, Chris, about spike protein shedding. I always look at the source. This friend who believes that vaccines killed 1 million people and not COVID. I ask for sources, and I find these are links that when I look at the link, it says, don't go here. This is, dangerous territory. And then I do fact check. So spike protein shedding, I heard someone wanting to avoid vaccinated people. Yeah, but spike proteins don't hurt you. So you might shed the spike protein because that's what we see. That's how we get immunity, but that in and of itself simply allows the virus to get into your cell. It in and of itself isn't. Okay, Medicare Part D covers RSV if it's recommended for you by the ACIP. Yeah, so but it's a question of may. And Medicare paid for my RSV. So Medicare doesn't do things that they're not supposed to. So it looks like Medicare covers RSV. So good questions, though. Let me look and see. Oh, yeah. So Kathy, I see Paxlovid. So I was exposed. I developed symptoms, cold symptoms, and I thought nothing. It was a cold. It's a very mild cold, just no fever, no malaise, just a little bit of a runny nose. But then I was going out with a couple of people who are concerned about COVID. And I said, well, I'll just test. I have a cold, but I'm going to test. So I tested negative. And then I went on a 5-hour bike ride race and did just fine. And then all of a sudden, my wife got the same cold I had. She tested negative, but then she lost her taste and she tested again positive. And then I tested positive. It was like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? Too late to get Paxlovid. So I think Paxlovid is effective and I recommend it. The sooner you take it, the better. After 5 days of your first symptom, its effectiveness really decreases. So we need to have a better system so that if you self-test and you're positive, you should get Paxlovid, I think, that day or within an hour, preferably. So I haven't done it yet, but I'm thinking of, just getting a prescription and keeping it in my first aid kit so that it's more effective the sooner you take it. And so there are ways, these are antiviral drugs, and there are ways that you can reduce the risk of serious illness. You hear some people complain about Paxlovid and say, well, there's rebound, but in the clinical trials, compared the symptoms dropped in those with Paxlovid. There is rebound, but compared to the control group, there's less illness overall because you get so much better with Paxlovid. Yes, sometimes you rebound, but you're still better off overall than not being treated. Yeah, so Paxlovid side effects were worse than COVID-19. So anecdotally, people may have individual effects. Some people get, a reaction to the vaccine, others don't. For some people, we have so much individual variability. Why did I barely have symptoms, and why wasn't I? Why did I not test positive? Why did my wife not test positive? I have no idea. I think what happened actually is that we've had all the boosters, and I think those boosters helped fight. If you think about the virus, it's got to get in. So it's got to go through antibodies in your mucosal secretions. And once it gets through there, now it's in the lung, and it's got to get into the cells and into the bloodstream. Well, there's circulating B cell antibodies, humoral, they call them humoral antibodies. And it sort of attaches and reduces the numbers, but maybe it might win the fight there, and it goes into the cells, and there's T cell immunity, cell mediated immunity, and it fights it. So I think the two of us had a, somewhat of an immune response. My wife did spend a day in bed with a fever, 101. Why we had the same exact vaccines. We lived together, we probably get the same illnesses. She had a little bit more serious illness. Neither of us had any antigen being excreted in our nose right after. It came much later, came probably for her 5 days, and for me 10 days after infection. Again, why it came later, maybe eventually the virus caught up and was replicating and producing antigen. So I see a hand. It looks like Cindy.
Hi. Yep. I just wanted to comment that I had COVID 3 weeks ago, and I contacted, by the time my physician assistant replied back and we had a video chat, I had 2 days of incredibly bad cold, a little bit of fever, some body aches, but just like laid out in bed. And then on the third day was when the physician assistant and I had a video chat, and I was feeling so much better. And she said, well, it's up to you whether you get the Paxlovid. I'll write the prescription and send it to the pharmacy, but I will tell you that it's more than likely that your symptoms are going to come back as strong or stronger than what you've experienced the past 2 days. And in her experience, that people that took Paxlovid were better off in the long term, that they didn't have the long COVID effects. But since I didn't lose my taste, and I didn't lose my sense of smell, she thought that I might be better off not getting the Paxlovid. So she was leaving it up to me.
Yeah.
I was feeling so much better that I decided not to get
Yep.
it.
We decided, Kate decided, and my wife decided not to get it. I think that's a very reasonable decision. I think it's symptom related. So the more there is evidence that it reduces the risk of hospitalization and death. And so if you're going to have a serious case, and those happen, then I think taking Paxlovid right away is certainly recommended. But for mild illness, it's a bit, the margin, if you have a relatively mild illness, even spending a day or two, not feeling well at all, that margin of benefit is going to be less than if you are having difficulty breathing and end up in the hospital. So everything we do, you have to think about the margin of benefit. And if you have mild illness, then that margin of benefit is going to be less. But so I think it's a reasonable thing. By the way, the risk of long COVID, I just saw studies about 15% of the US adults report having symptoms of long COVID. And I think the number is about 7% at present say they currently have No, I have that. I think I have that wrong. I think it's about 3% of people right now are experiencing symptoms of long COVID. You may talk to somebody, and I talked to a person, she said, I've not gotten my sense of smell back. It's still muted, especially for sweets, which she said is like, you know, sweets are great, but not when they don't taste sweet. So yes, I think being vaccinated, fully vaccinated, there's no doubt in my mind, you're better off being fully vaccinated than not. And second, there's no doubt in my mind that for serious illness, that Paxlovid early is recommended. But you know, there is this clinical decision making where all of a sudden you as a patient will be asked, so what do you think? Do you think you should get RSV? And you go, you're the doctor. Why are you asking me? Well, what kind of person are you? What are your values? You know, are you the type of person who always says rather be safe than sorry? Or are you the person who says, oh, I'm going to go for it. I'll take my punches. You know, I don't mind looking back saying, well, I took a risk and, you know, I lost. So patient preferences, that means to me is we don't have strong evidence one way or the other. So I think the recommendation that your provider gave you was sound.
There was a CNN story the other day about disease X. There is some other. Have you read or heard anything about disease X?
Tell me more. So you know what? I go to Dr. Google when I get these questions.
Yeah,
so
that's fine. It was a CNN story. I had no idea. So what do you say to people about Dr. Fauci when they accuse him of lying, of getting it wrong? What do you say as a public health professional to?
So I worked at CDC for 6 years. At that time, he was extremely well regarded. I find him to be incredibly intelligent and articulate, and able to speak on things when there's no sort of way to win. It's a Sophie's choice, really. You're going to make people mad on both ends. You're going to make the public health people mad, and you're going to make the people who deny science mad. And so I thought he walked the line just as a scientist should. By the way, knowing Robert Redford and the line of command, you just see these people standing like saying, I can't believe, you know, this is being said. So I just think he's an amazing public servant. He's incredibly smart, and his advice is sound. He's also, here's the issue with Fauci. He was not afraid to say, we don't know. He was not afraid to admit that what we thought then is not what we know now. And for some people, that makes him a waffler, you know, a two-faced. I don't think it does. We now know airborne transmission is a good example. We thought COVID was only transmitted person to person, 6 feet droplets. We've learned through some outbreak investigations like measles that it can be aerosolized and can, you know, spread further. Notice hospitals did not take aerosol precautions. Hospital took contact precautions. You could not afford to take aerosol precautions when somebody came into the hospital. That basically, I mean, you would have to put people in negative pressure suits and close down parts of the hospital. So that was a very tough decision to say we're going to consider it to be person-to-person spread, contact spread, and the evidence evolved that it can be transmitted through aerosol. That's a good example of, you know, looking back and saying, well, we were wrong. We didn't have the science at the time to know that. So I think but I think, you know, I can't think of a time when he was sort of not being honest and truthful and, you know, saying what needed to be said.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that.
Yeah. So this is James. You know, I think that is a problem. I see something here. I'll answer the question about the booster. So yeah, most people who call me say, Pat, can you prescribe me Paxlovid? And I'm a physician, I'm licensed to practice medicine, but you're not my patient, so I'm not going to be monitoring you. So no, I don't prescribe Paxlovid for my friends and family. You need to go to your doctor. And it's really frustrating when I can't get in, I can't get the call. This is, people need to realize that, so you went to the emergency room, urgent care not open, 2 to 3 hours there. They finally gave you a prescription. Yeah. Oh, so you ended up with incompatibility. Yeah. So our healthcare system is not prepared. In some countries, they have seamless connections between public health and healthcare. And this would be something where this would be administered through public health, through people where it's not your primary care doctor, it's you go to public health and you get a prescription. And our healthcare system is not good for this. I mean, frankly, we're better than we were before because of virtual visits. At least you can sometimes connect with somebody now virtually, which was impossible before. Nobody would answer an email, but now that's improved. And the question about the booster, this is probably a good way to end, because what COVID has taught us is there's no right answer or wrong answer. It's a question of risks. Do we know with certainty when the best time to get vaccinated following illness or illness with Paxlovid treatment? No, we don't know. We have evidence that suggests that your natural immunity will wane over 2 or 3 months following natural illness. But there's been no randomized trial to test when a vaccine should be given following natural illness. So we can only look at observational data, and there's all sorts of problems with observational data. And the other question is, what I said is the cost benefit. So I had COVID 3 weeks ago now. So when should I get my booster? I'm thinking right around the time my kids come for Thanksgiving. Why? Well, that happens to be about 2 months out, but also they bring so many viruses to visit with them. We have 6 grandkids. And so that's a time just before then that I want my immunity to be bumped back up. If we didn't have kids visiting, I might wait a little longer. The longer you wait after illness, the longer your booster is going to be effective, because all these COVID antibodies, partly because our immunity waned, partly because the viruses change, you're buying, 3 to 6 to 9 months. So if I can sort of rely on my natural immunity, maybe as long as I can, and then get the booster a little later. But again, depends on how often I go out, how I get exposed, whether I'm wearing a mask, or so many other variables that there's no right or wrong answer. I think the goal is to understand how this virus transmits, and first and foremost, stay as safe as you can, and then use the vaccines to, if you should get sick, to minimize your chance of ending up in the hospital or worse yet, dying from the disease.
Wow.
So I think those are the questions, but
Dennis,
it's the hour.
Dennis, have you seen anything from Mark? If you're there, Dennis, I don't know if your phone is on.
He's logged in.
Admitted. Yeah, I think he was just admitted, so I think he's.
Well, I want to thank you, Pat. It's really, really wonderful. I would get one more question about the origin of COVID, but I'm not sure that's worth arguing about.
Well, I'll just say the answer is it doesn't matter, because if it's a lab experiment, we need to be safer in the lab. If it came from wild animals, we need to be safer in our human contact with wild animals. So the answer to the question is only, it's an academic exercise. For practical purposes, we need safety in both areas. So
I was in Wuhan at one of their markets back in 2005, and it was amazing to see what was available to buy and eat, and in what condition it was being offered. In what they call the wet market. And even in 2005, it was just it was remarkable, and I didn't even know what to think about things being that you could eat. It was too much.
We've learned there's some things you shouldn't bring to a wet market. problem.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Yeah,
I'll turn it
thanks.
to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is very useful, very, very informative.
Great, thanks,
Pat.
Dennis. Yep.
Okay,
Thank you, Pat.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
All right. And Dennis, anything from Mark yet?
yes, he's here.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Mark, you want to unmute yourself?
Done.
Good. So now can,
He
let's
just-
see,
he
how do
just
I
voted
get?
present.
I'll
Um,
talk to him, Dennis.
How do I get, oh, there he is.
I got it.
Okay.
I got it.
There we
Oh,
go.
okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
So we are very fortunate from a number of different standpoints to have Representative Pocan with us. In part, it's because of what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. We have been alerted, and I've shared this with everyone, Mark, that it's possible that you might be yanked out and that you have apparently, as I understand it, your running shoes on, if that's necessary. But we'll hope that we can spend as much time as possible with you. Just briefly reminding people, Mark Pocan is our representative in Washington, D.C. in Congress. He has been filling that role for the last 10 years and has indeed gotten into some very impressive leadership positions. He was, until relatively recently, the head of the Progressive Caucus. He is currently the head of the Labor Caucus and also the Equity Caucus, and on the House Appropriations Committee. And those of you familiar with how Congress works, the Appropriations Committee is a super, super important committee. And I guess the other thing to share with you, just to put things in perspective, is that he excelled as a political science and journalism student at the University of Wisconsin. He was just fantastic. So
I had
Mark,
some great
go ahead.
professors, Dennis. I had some great professors.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you repeat that?
It's good to see everybody. And Dennis, thank you for the invite again, Terry. Appreciate it. And everybody, it's good to be here. We think they're going to call the vote at 1:30 to vacate the speaker, but they could do it sooner. On Saturday, for example, they gave us 15 minutes notice to vote on a 71-page continuing resolution that we hadn't been able to read yet. And since Kevin McCarthy is trusted by pretty much no one in our caucus for a very good reason, we wanted to read it first. So we had to do a few things to slow things down, and we got a couple hours to read it. And of course, we wanted to keep the government open all along. We just wanted to make sure nothing was thrown into the bill on Saturday. But at some point today, likely they'll have a vote to vacate the speaker. Bluntly, I don't think there'll be many, if any, Democrats supporting McCarthy. Honestly, been the worst speaker I've ever dealt with in either a state legislature or Congress. And I think it just shows that at some point you always have to have a respect for the institution broader than the respect for yourself. And you want to make sure that the institution's held well, and Kevin never has. It's always been about him becoming speaker. He gave up a lot of powers in order to get the title. He gave away so many that, a random sociopath can make a motion to vacate, and we're going to have a vote on it. And since he's lied and broken agreements with us right and left, there's no trust, period, in Kevin McCarthy, which we had at various levels with either Paul Ryan or John Boehner. So that vote likely going to happen. Like I said, it will not be a large number, if any, of Democrats who vote to keep Kevin McCarthy, and with whatever number are going to try to vacate. We'll see what happens. But I think the last time this happened might have been 1910, I believe, when Cannon, who now there's a building named after, kind of forced the hand on his opposition to do this vote. In this case, it wasn't Kevin forcing a hand. It was Kevin just out of incompetence having this land. And it wasn't because he sided with Democrats on a continuing resolution. It's because he's empowered them in every way possible, the extreme members of his caucus, that the 20 or 40 most extreme members run the caucus. Marjorie Taylor Greene is taken as a credible spokesperson by the caucus, and all of that is beyond the pale. So it's history happening soon. Hopefully I'll be able to spend the time with you, but I really know you always have great questions. So I'm not going to talk much in the beginning. I'd rather make sure I'm addressing your questions. Let me just say it's been a pretty rough session. I think I just kind of foreshadowed that with Kevin McCarthy. We had the lifting the debt ceiling, something that shouldn't even be a separate vote, bluntly. If you spend the money, it used to be prior to 2010. It's been off and on through history, but prior to 2010, that meant the debt ceiling automatically lifted because that changed then. We have a separate vote, which allows, again, a handful of people to muck the system up. Sure enough, that happened. We had an agreement that Kevin McCarthy negotiated on the debt ceiling, and he broke it 2 weeks later. And in appropriations, a committee that's largely been insulated from the craziness here, unfortunately, he put a bunch of the extremists on our committee, a handful, which is enough to make the committee dysfunctional. And we're right now, I'm supposed to be home this week and next week doing things in district. Instead, I'm here because normally in June and July, you do all the appropriation bills, but Kevin couldn't get his act together. And now he's letting them play fantasy Congress. So they're like cutting bills 30, 40% of funding from agencies, 30 to 40% of funding, as if that could be real in any way. And then throwing on a bunch of riders around abortion and diversity, equity, inclusion, and on pride flags and LGBTQ discrimination. So at the end of the day, these are jokes that are moving through, but we have to be here while he lets his crazies want to put every amendment out there. They're not going to be serious proposals for a reconciliation process between the Senate, which has worked in a bipartisan way, getting their appropriation stuff done. And for the first time ever, we haven't. And because of that, he's largely given the House no position in negotiations. So it's kind of sad because I was always happy. I wasn't on oversight and government reform. I was my freshman year. I got off of it very quickly. And I'm not on judiciary for a reason. I mean, people who largely go to those committees are there to fight the fight every day and, yell at people and do all that. And that's not saying that's not a place to do that. I just don't want to do it every day. I actually want to do something. And having done my time on the Joint Committee on Finance back home, I know the best way to show your values is where you put your investments, your tax dollars. And that's why appropriations has always had my interest. And that's why I love being on the committee. This session, this year, it's been a little different. So we're still in the middle of all that. And they've got 45 days to try to move it forward. We'll see what happens. If there's a new speaker, we'll see what happens. I don't know if I would, if I were in Vegas, I wouldn't be putting bets on much of anything because this is not a place where we do that right now. I'm going to stop there, honestly, Dennis. I'd much rather take questions and answer anything specific people have, but that's kind of currently where we're at. It's been a wild year of much distrust for Kevin McCarthy, rightfully so, now culminating possibly in him no longer being speaker, and we'll see where all this takes us.
What about the farm bill? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the farm bill should have been done by September 30th. It didn't. The FAA reauthorization should have been done. It didn't. We got the national defense authorization out of the House, completely different than the Senate. That has not been reconciled. So we're not really doing much of our work, right? That's part of the problem. The problem is right now we're okay, I think, on the farm bill. But if you don't have it done by January 1st, in particular for people in Wisconsin or across the country who are in dairy, there's a provision that goes back to, I believe it's somewhere in the 40s law, 1940s, that would make milk prices triple or more, depending where you live from a certain location in the United States. And that would be devastating for farmers and for consumers because milk would go way up. That's going to really decrease demand for farmers. And it's all going to happen because of ineffectiveness in Congress. We generally get things done right up to the deadline. I've found since I've been here, it's rare we do things in a methodical way. But having said that, there are some real problems if we don't get it done. Just the fact that the agricultural appropriations bill, they cut spending 41%, which would devastate the people who, grow our food for us, just shows again how potentially dysfunctional it could be. Fortunately, the Senate's still working pretty bipartisan on things.
We've got a number of questions in the chat, and if you'd like, I could just go ahead
Sure.
and repeat them.
Please.
That might be the most efficient. One issue is Ukraine.
Yeah.
The funding, as we all know, has sort of been put into some question, I guess. The question is, how serious is that? And something that I personally have found rather puzzling is that in the debate about Ukraine, kind of surprising that there's a debate period. We have a lot of people who you would think would be in favor of spending money in the defense industry. They don't seem to understand that the money that has been allocated for the most part is not going to the Ukraine, it's going to the defense industry. And that doesn't seem to be part of the public discussion at all.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll answer everything you'd like and just prod me if I don't. But nothing is normal right now with this Congress. So that's probably the easy statement. The problem is on Ukraine. I mean, literally, we have, I think, over 100 Republican members who voted the Vladimir Putin position, which is to essentially end support to Ukraine. And it is an anomaly, right? Because traditionally, the one thing Republicans really care about is defense spending, money for defense contractors. In fact, when we did the debt ceiling agreement, the one interesting hook that was put in was if they don't get the bill done or the bills done by January 1st, but there's a big asterisk, it's really April 30th, but that's an aside. If we don't have it done by then, it will trigger us going to 23 levels of spending, so the current year, minus 1%. The problem is that, different from the debt ceiling agreement, would cut $38 billion from defense spending and add $26 billion for non-defense discretionary spending, so healthcare and housing and veterans and everything else. So, I mean, clearly someone like myself would be quite fine with that, but it would take an awful lot of ineffectiveness to get there. And it's not really just the end of the year. It really, they have till about April 30th for that to really fully kick in. But this isn't normal times, right? I mean, none of these debates are normal, and the Ukraine debate is in particularly odd. So, Kevin McCarthy then agreed to have a separate vote, but then immediately, because you can't trust him, said, but it has to be tied to border funding, which of course has nothing to do with Ukraine. But that's Kevin McCarthy's incompetence as a leader, which is why he may not be leader or speaker anyway very soon. It's a very weird time, and the debate in particular on Ukraine. Look, I mean, many of us who are the most progressive, peacenik sort of folks would love to see, a diplomatic solution, right? We don't really want to continue to do this, but you can't just unilaterally disarm someone who's been invaded by another country right now. One of the options that we're really glad never happened is we didn't put troops on the ground. We never wanted to do that, and we've been able to not do that. But this is a dangerous position right now that many Republicans have, led by, of all, great thinkers, Marjorie Taylor Greene. So, I work in an interesting place, Dennis, but it's just the logic that always traditionally happened is no longer the logic, because it matters what Trump says. Don't forget, the National Republican Party, for the first time ever in the last convention, I shouldn't say first time ever, first time that I can remember, didn't have a platform. They don't have a statement of values, what it means to be a Republican. Instead, it's whatever Donald Trump said, which is why many of us think the Republican Party acts more like a cult than a political party, because it's about one individual and what they believe. And that's the problem, is if Donald Trump says something, they'll all jump over each other because they're afraid of what can happen from the extreme MAGA folks in their primaries, and they won't have their jobs to then do what he says. And people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are, not the sharpest crayon in the box, but are good disciples of Donald Trump, are out, doing his advocacy. And unfortunately, I think what's interesting, and I don't know the exact numbers on this, but it was something crazy, like 90% of the people have heard of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and like 25% of the people have heard of Kevin McCarthy. But it's true. It's like, that is where the Republican Party is these days. which is why many of us think that they're going to have a tough time holding on to their majority in the next Congress.
Interesting. Let's talk about the auto strike. You've been involved in labor policy from day one. What is your perspective on where we are with labor generally, but specifically the auto strike?
Yeah, so I think publicly we know we're almost at an all-time high. It may be a high at least in 50 years of public opinion on labor unions. And I think the reason is we've seen that the income inequality has grown so much right now between the lowest paid worker and the CEOs. It's over 350-to-1 ratio right now, where almost every other industrialized country, it's closer to 20 to 25-to-1 from the top paid employees to the lowest paid. But now with stock buybacks and with these mega millionaires out there, it's really gotten to a point that people understand as a worker, you need to be able to have a voice in your workplace, and the best place to do that is through a union, not just on wages and benefits, but also on safety and other working condition issues. So the public opinion is up there. We just saw a very big strike avoided with Teamsters and United Parcel Service, which is a good thing. On the auto industry side, the workers during the last economic downturn made a lot of concessions to the company in order to save the auto companies during that time, including a tiered wage system. The problem is now that they're making record profits and doing all these stock buybacks, they never shared anything back with their employees. And there's a few inconsistencies. One is you might be on the line doing the same job as two other people, and you have 3 different wages, not talking like $1 or $2 an hour difference, but $10 an hour difference because of what they agreed to as some concessions. And they're trying to get rid of that. They're trying to have some other securities and protections, especially as the auto industry is turning to an electric-based vehicle. But the one I think is most egregious is these companies are trying to get around the contracts that they've always known. And I grew up in Kenosha. I grew up in an auto town, right? American Motors, and then it was Renault, then Chrysler at the end was making Jeep engines. 14,000 people out of 74,000 at their high point were making cars in my hometown. So I know this area fairly well. I think the most egregious thing they're doing now is they're forming these joint ventures with companies like Motorola or other companies to do batteries for vehicles, but they're trying to get around the contracts completely. So in one of the battery manufacturing facilities, I believe it's in Ohio, but it could be Indiana, in case I'm getting my wrong state. They're paying people $16.50 an hour to start, and in 7 years, $20 an hour. And these are actually more dangerous than working on the line because of the chemicals and other things you're working with on batteries. And they're really trying to get around and break the idea that you've had with auto manufacturing and good family supporting wages. So that's a part of what they're fighting over. I think the strike has been pretty strategic. I give their leadership a lot of credit. They haven't just shut everything down. They've been strategically doing it. Depending what companies are working with them. At the beginning, Ford was working well with them, so they didn't strike additional Ford facilities. They did Stellantis and GM. Now Stellantis is working with them, so they're going after the other ones, and they're using it as a tool as opposed to a blunt instrument, which I think is smart. So we'll see where this all gets to, but I think the way they're working and from a lot of the conversation we hear on a pretty regular basis, one, I think public is with them, the public support is with the workers. And two, I think what they're asking for is very reasonable. And I think they're on a decent path right now.
Is there any role that you anticipate Congress being asked to play?
No, we never should. I was one of the outliers when the president asked us to get involved in the rail strike last December, because the whole idea of a union contract is a private contract. Congress doesn't get involved in private contracts. And we were being asked to do that. And honestly, there was no sick pay whatsoever involved in the proposal that they were asking us to vote on. Not only should we not be involved in private contracts, but there were some real problems with what they were asking us to vote on. So I actually voted against that at the time because we weren't allowing a private contract, process, the union process to happen. And then separately, people then introduced bills to have 7 paid sick days. And quite honestly, I also didn't agree with that because the average union contract has 10 days of paid sick leave. And here we are, Congress telling people in private contracts what amount of it was just a period where we didn't want to go there. So we wrote a letter to the White House during the UPS strike to stay out of it, because it did still have a big impact. UPS, with a lot of businesses, including my own, delivers, but we didn't want to be there. And we got a large number of Congress to sign that letter. In fact, it was a bipartisan letter saying stay out of it. So I hope that one experience was an anomaly because of the time it was at, but we need to let these things happen on their own. And Congress doesn't really have a role unless there's a real important reason, which I've yet to see.
Hmm. You may have heard a rumor that there's a redistricting issue in Wisconsin.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And let me specifically ask you one dimension to it. Most of the attention has understandably gone to the assembly districts, which automatically deals with the Senate district, since 3 assembly districts equals 1 Senate district. But not a lot of attention has been made to the congressional districts. Do you want to maybe bring us up to date on where we stand with the congressional districts and the redistricting issue there?
Yeah. So I think legislatively, most people have focused on the maps that they're some of the worst in the country, right?
Right.
Clearly, 54% of the people voting for a Democrat for assembly getting 36 and 99 seats shows it, more than anything. But the congressional maps, I mean, we're again a completely purple state where people win statewide office often by less than 1%, and we have 2 Democrats out of 8. So, one could just look at that alone and say there's probably some issues. If you looked at the makeup of the 3rd congressional district, and I may just happen to have that on my phone, this is an example of a less than stellar drawing of a map. I would argue. I didn't know you were going to ask that, but I happen to keep the 3rd open quite often. I have opinions on that district. So they would be separate lawsuits, and there are going to be separate lawsuits, I believe. The biggest question would be there, I think, needs to be a little movement on the state maps for a federal lawsuit to happen, and who might bring that lawsuit. So I can't say with 100% certainty that there's going to be a lawsuit offered on the federal maps, but should there be one, I think there's a very strong case that there should be new maps there as well as state legislative maps.
Uh-huh. Have you thought much about ranked choice voting? Do you have a position on that?
Yeah, I had introduced measures when I was in the state legislature to allow local communities to try it as an experiment. I'm not sure I'm there as a proponent one way or the other, but I think it's a valid way to try elections, right? And there's a lot of different arguments, and I don't know if any of them have really convinced me yet that it's the right thing to do, but it does save the whole primary process. People don't always vote. I want to have the maximum number of people vote and have it have an impact. It's been interesting watching it in Alaska. That's been a little bit of an experiment, but I'm not a proponent or a distractor. In fact, like I said, I introduced stuff to allow local units of government to be laboratories of democracy, but I'm not an advocate or not.
Okay. There's a question about leadership in Democratic caucus generally. There's obviously been a change. Nancy Pelosi is still in Congress, and she's going to be running for re-election. So the question has kind of 2 dimensions. One, focusing on the new leadership and your thoughts there. And the other is a question about the role that Nancy Pelosi is playing, even though she's not in a formal position.
Yeah. So, I mean, Nancy was incredibly effective, right? As leader, we passed 4 giant bills last session that will have impact for decades. And we had the same margin the Republicans do. And look at the disarray they're having, and look at the discipline and effectiveness, more importantly, that we had under her. And to her credit, she and Steny Hoyer in particular realized that we have a lot of talent, and maybe, they've been doing it for 20 plus years. It's time to allow some others, so you have not just a bench, but you have some people building experience for the future. And she's been an amazing ex-leader. She has not tried to put her thumb on the scale of things, is still very helpful where needed. And I've been very impressed with her as an ex-leader, and that's a true compliment to her style. I also, for full disclosure, am a big fan and friend of Hakeem Jeffries and Catherine Clark, who both came from my class, the 2012 class. Hakeem, I gave one of his seconding speeches when he ran for leader. He's an extraordinary talent. It used to be when I was in charge of special order hour my freshman year for the Progressive Caucus, I had to get some members to join us after votes and make our case on various progressive issues. And I'd often get Hakeem to join me. And, we always had our, extensive, notes from our offices that we're all working off of, when we were talking about things. And, Hakeem would always be one of the most articulate, members. He was great arguments, great passion, great delivery. And then he'd walk away from the podium and he'd walk away with nothing. He had no notes from his office. It was in his head, and he's an extraordinary talent. And I think he will be an extraordinary speaker. Just watching right now, the unanimity that we have as a caucus is because we all really like and respect Hakeem Jeffries. So we are poised for a lot should we take the majority, because we've got a new leadership team that have their respective members. They're very inclusive. In fact, if anything, and this isn't a knock to Nancy, but she'd been around for so long and had so many friends that she worked with, it was hard sometimes as a newer member to be brought into the team, where Hakeem has got a very inclusive style. So more of us are doing more work. Last night we had a dinner to talk about this McCarthy thing, and there were probably 15 of us there, of people that lead some of the major caucuses and others in leadership. And we kind of worked on the strategy for today. So it's a very inclusive style. I think it's in the long run going to be very, very good for our caucus. And, I officially hit the median age in Congress finally this year. We are a little older of a bunch, 58 and a half, I think, is the median age. I turned 59 in August. So finally hit that. But it's good to have the diversity of the caucus more represented. I mean, I was glad to last August travel to Orlando to help Maxwell Alejandro Frost when he ran at 26 years old for Congress and get elected. But he's an extraordinary talent. He's very good at what he does. And it's part of the demographics of the country. Not everyone has to be a millionaire. Half of my colleagues are. It's good to have diversity. And I think we now represent that diversity more than ever.
Another question that was asked about leadership, and that is, and if you want to duck this one, go ahead. And that is, okay, so if Kevin McCarthy can't continue as speaker, who else?
Yeah, I have no idea what they're going to do on their side of the aisle. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years this year, local, state, and federal government. One, I've never been as saddened by the overall state of politics as I am right now. Clearly, Donald Trump did more damage, in my opinion, to this country and to politics and to governing than any individual in my lifetime, or going back quite a while. He brought this to be a blood sport. He brought the disingenuous that he did. He brought the hate for other citizens, of other humans, other people in our country, the outright racism that's out there. And this has now permeated our day-to-day experience here in Congress. So, when Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually a serious leader, what, I won't say the words, this is a problem. Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz is the most sociopathic person I have ever served with in government, 30 years. He loves to manipulate things. He'll change his mind halfway just to watch it all change, like he's the puppet master. And he has his own ethics issues. Look, it's a hard time to be in Congress. I've been trying to recruit people in certain congressional districts in Wisconsin. And sometimes the DCCC, our campaign committee arm, will say, how come you're having a hard time in some areas? I'm like, because we're normal people in Wisconsin. There are people who don't want to go to do what I'm doing. Like I go home every weekend to Wisconsin because I love Wisconsin. I live there for a reason. But there's a lot of people who don't act and think that way here. And like I said, I was a bit insulated during the worst of Trump by being on appropriations because we still functioned. we knew we had things to get done. And there are Democrats I like and respect on that committee. We still got the job done. That suddenly now has changed to a point that that's now not happening. So whoever they put forward is going to govern the exact same way with the crazy caucus they have, unless they can figure out how to corral them. But they have a 5-seat margin. They have true extremists. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I can't think of a person since the Civil War who has publicly said that we should have a divorce of the states. She thinks the red states and blue states should be separated. Like, that is beyond insane, in my opinion, that a major elected official would say that. So I don't know who they'll put forward. Scalise clearly is the number 2, but he's also he's going through cancer treatment. Excuse me. Emmer from Minnesota has been mentioned by some of the Freedom Caucus people, but who knows with these folks? And, it would only take a few moderates to come and work with us, but that will never happen in this current political environment. You are DOA on your next election if you work with Democrats, because in Republican primaries, the MAGA extreme base is so strong and overrepresented in the vote that you won't serve here anymore. So good moderates, or even not even moderates, good conservatives who understand you have to negotiate and compromise to get something done are silenced right now, waiting for this all to end if they haven't already outright left. I mean, Reed Ribble was a good friend of mine who represented the Green Bay area, was truly a conservative, but a respectful person, and realized you had to compromise sometimes to get things done. And he, if you follow his Twitter, is, aghast at what's currently happening. And he's right. And, when Wisconsin starts electing insurrectionists to Congress, we're going to infect ourselves with this too. I mean, you've watched a little bit of our newest member who now has drunken parties on a regular basis in his office. He offers beer to every single person who comes in for a meeting. Even youth organizations at 9:30 in the morning get offered beer because he thinks that's what people from Wisconsin should do, because he's not really from Wisconsin. It's crazy. And then, he had the incident where he had the party till midnight, gave a tour to 15 people of the Capitol, and then he swore at and berated Senate pages for laying on the ground, enjoying the floor. And he made up some story about where the bodies of dead Civil War soldiers laid. And then I went and looked at the footage. I wanted to have it released, but the family members asked that it not be, because they were afraid of MAGA retribution on their kids and their families. So I went and looked at it and watched the whole thing. And at the end of all this, he went back to his group and took like a curtsy bow. He was performing for them. Like, we've now infected our state delegation with people who are essentially Marjorie Taylor Greene without the dress. So it's a tough time, Dennis. You've seen me talk about this for many years. I am as disheartened as I ever could be. I'm still an optimist at heart, and I think we can change this around when Trump is out of the picture. I think those more reasonable voices will surface back up, because whoever is the top of the ticket has a megaphone probably 10,000 times any of a member of Congress. And as long as he's spewing the stuff that he does, it's hard. But maybe when he's out of the picture, we have a chance to make things better.
Yeah, as you know, the whole reason why we had primaries was to take the power away from machine bosses that were running the parties. Now the primaries seem to be back as an instrument of bosses, the MAGA people, Trump and the like. And that has serious implications, as you know. Is there anything on the horizon that we can look to get over this, so that we can get beyond this kind of control by Trump, whether he's in office or not?
Well, I mean, the courts might. He's got several major charges against him, right? That could be a factor. Doesn't look like the Republican electorate it looks like he's leading in a huge way on the Republican primary. One is we can make sure this never happens to the Democratic Party, right? Because it could. You could have, individual like him who appears to be a populist, but is really a fascist, just from another perspective. And we have to make sure that never happens. And hopefully this is a good learning lesson, a visual learning lesson in what happens when that does happen. So I'm very committed on that side and glad I don't see that on our horizon. But, you know, as long as more Republicans won't stand up to him, and don't forget the last session, the only two did were Adam Kinzinger, who decided not to run again, and Liz Cheney, who then lost her primary. I mean, he has a lot of control on that primary electorate. And until people stand up to someone like him for the damage that he can do to this country, it's going to be difficult. So that's why I said, fortunately, I do think he's at the end of whatever career he has, whether it be, there's a lot of ways that could happen. So we may just have to have a little patience. But man, it's just disheartening because, like, I mean, you know, I'm friends with people that people can't understand. I'm friends with back home. You know, Republican speaker is being one of them. And, you know, at the end of the day, you have to compromise to get things done, and you have to have relationships with people. But that has changed so much here, that here we are with Republicans fighting Republicans, vacating a speaker, and none of us are coming to rescue because of how bad the situation is.
Yeah. What do you think the prospects are of the 14th Amendment keeping Trump off of the ballot in Wisconsin or elsewhere?
Unlikely. I think those are all great theoretical things that there are plenty of ways to sidetrack enough that they'll never happen. Just my opinion.
Yeah. One of the issues, as you know, in Wisconsin is the fake electors. Doesn't seem like much is happening, at least not publicly, regarding the fake electors. It has in some other states, but not Wisconsin. Do you know what the deal is, and are they going to be able to get away with what they did?
No, I can tell you nationally, that's part of the DOJ case, right, is around this. So that's good. Because if you don't prosecute on this, you're allowing someone to do this again, right? You have to kind of slap the hand so that no one decides this is a future path. So we would be remiss if we don't. I believe, but I can't say this definitively, Dennis, that in Wisconsin, part of why they haven't done more in the state level is because of the federal case. I think that's why that they've been kind of letting the federal case proceed and not trying to grandstand on it, because you easily could, right? You could say you're doing this or that and just try to make a name for yourself if you were Josh Call. And instead, because you actually care about the end result, perhaps you're letting the federal process do what it needs to do, since it is part of what they're pursuing right now. So, but I don't know that definitively. It's just my guess. I know Josh pretty well. I think Josh is really smart and really good, and I don't see him being afraid of doing something. I think it's just he really wants the legal system to work, and the legal system could probably best work right now with DOJ doing what they're doing.
So he would rely on the federal government rather than, because there is a state law that.
Yeah, I believe, though, that's what he's looking at. And if for some reason that didn't happen through the federal, we still could do it at the state level. I mean,
True.
You know, I think, though, again, I've not asked him, but just when I watch how he operates in general, he's a smart legal scholar, really. And I think he sees this as the best path. Trust me, I'd like to make sure that no one ever tries to do it again in Wisconsin. I mean, it's just so outrageous. But then again, we just reelected a senator who tried to give those fake electors to the vice president. So, you know, maybe sometimes we have to look in the mirror a little too at where we are as a citizenry on this issue.
Yeah. Someone has raised the concern about the F-35s at Truax, and pointing out the dangerous effects, the downside of having those in the Madison area, and wondering what your thoughts are on the F-35s.
Yeah, so this is one of these ongoing things that I have found. The Department of Defense is probably, they and the FDA are probably the two agencies that care about Congress the least, what we think. And despite many conversations, emails, and letters with defense, they're going to do what they want regardless. And that's part of why I've been trying to fight to have a legitimate audit done on Department of Defense. They've had 5 of them, failed every one. The last audit, they could only account for 39% of their equipment, and they think they're above Congress and they ask for more money. It's pretty ridiculous, but that's an aside we could talk about. When it comes to the F-35, my biggest concern right now is what just happened, where an F-35 kind of went wayward. They couldn't find it, and it ultimately crashed in a field. But if you have F-35s in the district, and there's something like 800 some deficiencies that they only have addressed like 20 or 30 of them. Now, there's different degrees, right? There's big deficiencies and there's small ones. But I do have concern over safety by having them in the district. Now, we've had F-16s previously. Some of it is around noise. Some of it is around, I think people just prefer not to have militarization in the district, rightfully so. And some of it is around other concerns, including PFASs and other issues like that. My biggest concern right now is just given the safety and the number of deficiencies that we're seeing in this wayward jet. I mean, really, how can you lose an F-35, right? And go through the drama on that. If that's going to happen in our backyard, we need more assurances. And I doubt Department of Defense will give me them. I'm real blunt. I mean, they're the worst to deal with when it comes to accountability. And but we're going to continue trying.
Yeah. Question came up about asking what your sense is of a prospect of having some kind of a compromise given the current situation with the Freedom Caucus and the lack of
Compromise on what?
reaching some kind of agreement. Sorry, what?
A compromise or agreement on what? I'm sorry.
On the general issue of the budget, curtailing spending, that kind of thing, putting some kind of a cap.
Yeah, here's what my guess is going to happen, but this is not a year that guesses are very good, Dennis. I'll just be blunt. So, my fear of being on appropriations, I mean, I respect the institution and I respect compromise and getting things done. And that's, again, why I love the committee, other than this year, where we've had some issues. But generally what happens is if you do the hard work, even though you have Democrats and Republicans, you compromise, we'll have a House version, there's a Senate version, there's a committee that reconciles, and you have the budget, whether it comes back as an omnibus, one big bill, or individual bills. We often wind up doing it as an omnibus. It's not ideal, but it's part of how things often have happened in recent history. But you wind up with a better product. This time, because the Republicans agreed through the debt ceiling, lifting the debt ceiling, they made agreements so we wouldn't have problems right now around the budget. And then Kevin McCarthy broke it 2 weeks later. In order to appeal to his extreme members again, he went and budgeted everything to 22 levels against the agreement, which is basically a 22% across the board cut for everything that's non-defense. Defense didn't get cut, it got an increase. And then he threw all these riders in around abortion and equality issues and diversity, equity, inclusion that are never going to become a law. But we didn't do the regular work that we do. So we send out these, honestly, crap packages that make, the extremities happy. Look, we cut spending, but it's not real. You can't do this. You're going to cut Meals on Wheels, say really 20%, in order to, make someone from a state I don't vacation in happy. That's kind of what they're doing these days. So at the end of the day, the Senate did it in the right way. Every committee, the worst vote was 24-4, and there were many that were 28-0. They worked in a bipartisan way, like we sort of used to on many things. And they passed these for the most part on the floor with like 75 plus, 79 plus votes in a responsible way. So Tammy Baldwin was following me speaking to a group, and I was talking about this. And I said, Tammy, I mean, doesn't this mean at the end of the day, the bill will be 80% what the Senate wrote because you did everything responsibly and right, and we did this that we know is going nowhere, but Kevin had to pass in order to keep his speakership, so to speak. And Tammy goes, no, I think it's going to be more like 95% of the Senate version. And so he gave up our institution's say in something as important as the appropriations process. That's why, again, it's hard to respect Kevin McCarthy. All he cares about is being called speaker. And because that's all he's going to care about, That's probably why he won't be called it maybe after today. It's just, but it is a tough time. I mean, I hope I don't sound too pessimistic as I say these things, but it is hard to lie. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm gonna tell you exactly the way it is. But it's an awful time. That's why when I've tried to recruit people and they say, no, why would I want to do that? I don't push back because I understand and respect it. I mean, I'm a bit more of a tenacious, chihuahua on an ankle sometimes, and I'm willing to stick through it. But I could understand why someone wouldn't want to, leave their family for 3 out of the 4 weeks a month to come up here and do whatever it is the hell we're doing. It's hard to justify.
Yeah. Is Social Security funding an issue right now? Is that on the agenda?
It should be. And among Democrats, it is. So John Larson, a colleague of mine from Connecticut, has a bill. I think it's the 21st Century Social Security Act, which is something I've supported. We need to make some changes. The problem is, first of all, we do everything last minute here, right? So since the crisis isn't imminent, it may not happen, although it should. This is the right time to actually address the issue. But what his bill does is a couple of things. One, it would lift that cap. Right now, when you make more than, I think it's 160,000, give or take, you don't put another dime into the Social Security Trust Fund. I would just lift the cap, period. I think because President Biden has said no one who makes less than 400,000 will be taxed extra. We've left the 160 to 400,000 untouched, and it lifts the cap at 400,000. So if you make 400,000 or more, you're going to pay more. That's fine, but honestly, then you have a donut hole, and it's money. One of the many stupid things that we do in government. But it would make more sense just to keep it unilateral. If you kept it unilateral and lifted it, you pay for the fund for 75 years in the future, and we won't have this debate until our I don't have any children, but people who would be my peers' grandchildren are now in Congress dealing with it, right? That would be the smartest thing to do, but we're probably that could be more difficult. But that is one part, to actually fund it into the future. Two, it would change the increase from the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, to the CPI-E, which is spending that more seniors have. So maybe a little less on gasoline, travel, and more on things like medicines. And it represents where spending happens by seniors. And that would be more of an increase. And I think that would be good to do. And that's part of his bill. And another thing is it lifts the cap on how much you earn, which I think is around 18,500 before you get nicked on your Social Security, to somewhere around 53, 54,000, because that hasn't been adjusted for in a long time. And it does some other things as well. But I think that is the kind of thinking that we need to go forward. But it is fixable. That's the most important part, just by simply lifting that cap on how much you pay in. It's a regressive tax right now because only the poorest are really paying it. And then beyond that, the wealthiest don't. But I don't see it happening in the near horizon. However, it is one of the top things Democrats talk about as a priority. And if we got in the majority, it could be something that is taken up before the deadline.
A question related to getting to the majority. What are your thoughts about the 3rd congressional district in Wisconsin? Is that indeed where Democrats have the highest chance of switching from Republican to Democrat?
Yeah, so I can talk about things I can't tell you to vote for one person or the other. I'm in my office.
Right.
But I can talk about this generally. I think the 1st and the 3rd congressional districts have been targeted by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They're probably the tightest margin between the parties. And if there were new maps, those are the two that you probably see the biggest change in, is my guess. But having said that, the 3rd district, because Derek Van Orden was just elected, it's always the most likely time you're going to pick up a seat is at that time. Because that district, Brad Path, who had no national support financially, only lost it by 11,000 votes, 52-48. Because Derek Van Orden has come to Congress and not delivered on anything he promised. I mean, from his whole, this, as I mentioned, the parties in his office, offering everyone beer, swearing at teens, all of that kind of stuff, but also his votes, I mean, he's voted for all these extreme measures they've had that cut spending to the point that, when you're starting to vote to cut Meals on Wheels, you can't quotes and votes are different. When you got a vote you can show to what he's voted on, that's different than when you're running. Now he's got things that people can hold him accountable, and he's pretty much failed the promises I think he made. I think that makes the district the most competitive, and there's going to be a competitive primary on the Democratic side in the 3rd district, and then someone will be challenging him, but that is probably the most likely to flip.
Oh, okay. What is your sense of the percentage of Republicans that are really for Donald Trump, especially given all of the court problems that he's faced and the like? But is it really the majority of Republicans?
I'll tell you, it's about half, I would say, and it's very subjective, but I'm doing it based on the Ukraine vote is a good example. I don't think there are many traditional Republicans who would be against Ukraine if it wasn't for Donald Trump saying things that he said around it. So I think those are the folks that are probably the most supportive of Donald Trump. Certainly there are the cheerleaders in Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert and those folks. But it's really 20 to 40 people that are the most extreme that cause most of the problem. But there's probably another, total of 100 plus that are Trumpian, at least in their support of him. And I would argue his racist policies. I think the core of support for Donald Trump comes out of racism. It's really the demographics in the country are changing. A lot of Caucasian people, particularly Caucasian males, aren't ready to see that transition. And they see him as their last hope. And he's played that up tremendously and really fostered that hatred, which is why one of the reasons I'm so disgusted by his type of politics, because it's just around fear and, the opposite of Barack Obama talking about hope, trying to make us aspirational. Here it makes you perspirational, you're nervous about everything. Right. And unfortunately, about half the Republicans probably are there.
Spending an hour with you can't help but come away, on the one hand, pretty disgusted with a lot of the stuff that's going on. But you keep talking about being optimistic. Why should we be optimistic?
Well, because we have to. It's our right. It's our country. We want to make sure that we continue to have progress. And we've got, when you think of other aspects of life, research on diseases, we're living longer, we're able to make it so that hopefully people can support their families better with good family supporting jobs. We're making more things in the United States. There's so much positive out there in the country. But our political process is a little bit broken right now. And, I think, again, largely broken by a charlatan named Donald Trump, who part of it was being on TV helped make him someone that people saw differently, right? And that's a little bit of our society right now, and that worries me. But taking him out of the picture, I do think we can get back to where we keep moving the country forward, including on the government side, and we did so much good in that last session. I mean, Dennis, when we passed an infrastructure bill, 4 presidents, including other Democratic presidents, talked about it. We got it done last session. And that's going to rebuild roads and bridges and water delivery systems, broadband, let 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. That's great. And then when we invested, start making things again, specifically computer chips, that we need to do that. I disagreed with Bill Clinton, quite honestly, when we decided to go towards globalization, make things in other countries. We forgot about what about here? And we noticed that's a problem. Now we can do that again, and we should do that. And even on the Inflation Reduction Act, where we try to help lower the cost of inflation around healthcare and healthcare and energy, we did things like on healthcare, cap insulin costs for those on Medicare. We want to do it for everyone. Republicans wouldn't let us, but at $35, where no more than $2,000 out of pocket for medicines if you're on Medicare, negotiating drug prices for Medicare. We did some really good things that were helpful. And on energy, it's probably some of the most climate change friendly legislation that it is the most climate change friendly legislation we've ever passed. So I look at that thing. We just did that 2 years ago, even during some of this muck, right? So we can do it again. It's just right now, I think we got to be very worried about what happens in November of 2024 for a lot of reasons, because it could affect the future of the country. And right now, for the first time, I mean, we've really hit this real impasse here in the House of Representatives, which is, again, you're illustrated by the vote to vacate a speaker today. And I believe in the institution. It's why some people don't understand why I sometimes point to Glenn Grothman as one of my closer colleagues from Wisconsin. It's because he believes in the institution. We disagree on many things, trust me. But you got to be able to work with people and compromise and negotiate. But fundamentally, you got to at least believe in the institution you're in. And I do believe in it. And it's painful right now, but I know that sometimes you got to eat things you don't like, in order to be healthy. It's no different than, being involved right now and caring about it to make sure that we're going to have a future. So, I as much as it's the toughest time ever, but I still haven't lost my optimism. I'm just dealing with a lot more muck and hoping that doesn't drown out the optimism.
Well, let me just echo what a number of people are making in the chat session, and that is, you are amazing. We are very fortunate to have somebody who is representing us, who has the knowledge, the competence, and the passion that you do. So thank you for doing that, and keep on.
I appreciate it, Dennis. Thank you. And, happy new speaker day. I don't know what to say, but I wish I was actually back home doing this as originally planned with you, but hopefully by the weekend, and hopefully we'll get something done besides this today. But as always, I love being with your group. You got some of the best questions. And again, I owe you, my good professors who helped get me here. You don't forget those who brought you to the dance. So thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it.
No. Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it.
Take care, everybody. We'll see ya.
Okay. Yep.
Bye.
Bye now. Okay, well, we'll see everybody next week and talk about civil discourse, I guess, huh? So have a good week.